There are times when the human heart reaches its limit, when a medical diagnosis seems like a sentence, when loneliness echoes in the silence of the early morning, when emotional exhaustion makes the soul wish only for rest. Anyone who has cried until they no longer had the strength to pray knows what I am talking about. There is a pain that no words can describe, an emptiness that seems to swallow everything around it. And it is precisely at this time, when everything seems lost, that God does something that science cannot explain and that despair would never imagine. He sends a living word, a specific verse, like a breath direct from heaven, crossing the barriers of the mind and going straight to the most wounded point of the soul. Can you remember what your silent cry was? That moment when only God knew the depth of your pain? Today, in this video, we will walk through the Psalms, revisit the cry of the broken, and reveal the verse that was able to bring healing in the midst of chaos. Stay with me until the end, because I believe there is a move of God reserved especially for you, now. In the midst of life's shadows, there is a silence that weighs more than emptiness. Feeling abandoned, carrying a weight that seems impossible to leave behind, is an experience that spans generations. A suppressed cry often rises in the human heart when there is no longer the strength to pray out loud, when tears speak for us, when hope seems to have locked the door and thrown away the key. It is in this deep place that the echoes of Psalm 130 resonate, where the psalmist writes that out of the depths he cries out to the Lord and asks that his voice be heard. The cry in the midst of an emotional desert, the feeling that the cry is swallowed up by an absolute void, is something that touches the soul of those who listen in silence. At that time, when the psalmist expressed this plea, he was probably experiencing a moment of great anguish. Perhaps he was facing oppression from enemies, social rejection, or an internal spiritual crisis. The text has become universal because it conveys human vulnerability in its rawest state, when no solution can be found within one's own limits. And the psalmist dares to call, still without certainty, without promising answers, simply trusting that the Lord can hear and respond. This feeling is repeated today, sometimes in the midst of family breakups, medical diagnoses, and unexpected endings that come without warning. We know that this deep wound exists, which does not always find words to define what hurts, but which nevertheless asks to be heard. Psalm 122 serves as a brief sigh, a direct message. In my distress, I cried to the Lord, and he heard me. These are just a few words, but they reflect a transformative experience, the urgency of a heart that can no longer bear the weight, and when seeking help, finds acceptance. The connection between these two texts is not lost in the dust of time. On the contrary, it spans the ages and is renewed. The deep cry finds an immediate response, even if silent, even if without guarantees of visibility. Both the psalmist and many who go through crises know that there comes a time when the only recourse is to raise one's voice. But they also know that what once felt like an insurmountable wall can sometimes crack, even if imperceptibly, allowing a gap for hope. As the words echo, we become aware that the most important thing is not just to be heard, but to realize that there is still life left to cry out. This in itself changes something within those who dare to speak in silence. And when we remember the psalmist's cry, even without knowing where the answer would come from, we are reminded that there is a point of contact between the human and the divine, that the one who listens can also respond. And it doesn't matter if we don't have a quick response or a visible rupture, there is a listening that honors every tear, every soundless word. In this whirlwind of doubts, Psalm 120 leaves a fundamental mark. The psalmist's words are not an invitation to eternal despair, but a declaration of someone who struggled to find an echo amidst so much inner noise. The echo is not just the repetition of what was said, but the encounter with a creator who still cares, even when circumstances say otherwise. The narrative continues without urgent pause, as there are still emotional territories to be explored. And in this space of prayer and recognition of pain, the first question that sustains the soul arises. What makes our voice heard amidst the universal cry of humanity? The answer is not right there in sight, but it begins to reveal itself when we see that the cry does not fall into a bottomless pit. Some answer forms, even if it is the simple comfort of realizing that we are not alone in our solitude. The weight of waiting often turns the soul into a silent battlefield. When answers do not come, when solutions seem distant, and when time passes, taking with it the last crumbs of hope, the human heart begins to question what once seemed so certain. This was also the case with a man who lived these dilemmas so intensely that he transformed his crisis into poetry. In Psalm 73, Asaph gives voice to a type of suffering that is not just physical or emotional, but deeply spiritual. He observes the world around him and cannot understand why those who live corruptly seem to prosper while the righteous face endless struggles. This questioning is not limited to Asaph's reality. Even today, many look around them and wonder why their efforts to do good seem in vain. Why is honesty so often rewarded with suffering? Why do those who seek integrity face so many losses, while those who choose crooked paths reap visible benefits? The psalmist goes so far as to say that he kept his heart pure in vain. The pain of social and spiritual injustice begins to corrode even the strongest faith. Within this confusion, there is a detail that reveals the depth of Asaph's internal conflict. He recognizes that by exposing his crisis, he could hurt the faith of the weakest. For this reason, he keeps much of his anguish to himself, as if carrying a hidden burden. But silent suffering does not lessen the weight of doubt, and each new dawn becomes a continuation of the same unanswered question. What Psalm 73 makes clear is the reality that even those who know God can go through a period when their faith wavers, when the solid ground seems to give way. The psalmist does not try to disguise the crisis, does not adopt an artificial posture of optimism, nor does he paint his pain with softer colors to please the eye of those who observe him. He is honest in his vulnerability, and this honesty gives the text a strength that spans centuries. This phase of questioning is common in the journey of those who decide to trust. Faith is not a constant state of mind. It is not a linear feeling that only grows steadily. There are falls, moments of deep doubt and internal confrontations that no one sees. And it is precisely by facing all of this that the answer, when it comes, becomes even more significant. As Asaph watches the prosperity of the wicked, his heart grows bitter. He describes how envy began to cloud his perspective, how looking at the lives of others made him lose focus on what really mattered. This experience of destructive comparison is still very present today. Social media, for example, intensifies this process by offering a showcase of apparent happiness, where the pain of others is camouflaged by carefully edited images. Asaph's crisis, despite having occurred many centuries ago, reflects a human dilemma that remains relevant today. The feeling of injustice can steal the shine of hope. When the mind is fixated on the apparent victory of those who do not fear God, discouragement becomes a constant presence. Asaph describes how suffering ate away at him from within, as if an emotional poison were slowly spreading. However, even immersed in this atmosphere of disbelief, he maintained a tenuous connection with the Lord, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of spiritual stubbornness, perhaps because of a hope that still breathed in some forgotten corner of his heart. God's silence during this period is another element that deepens the psalmist's pain. There is no record of him receiving visions, dreams, or signs during this phase of inner conflict. The lack of concrete answers caused Asaph's anguish to increase, leading him to a state of near give-up. This lack of response is often what hurts those seeking divine intervention the most. The weight becomes a dark corridor where each step is accompanied by doubts. But there is a subtle detail in the psalmist's words. He is still speaking to God, even if it is in the form of a confession. His crisis does not completely distance him from faith, but it keeps him in a painful dialogue, even without the hope of being heard. This is a powerful aspect of human spirituality. Even in the deepest doubt, even when the heart cries out questions without an echo, the act of continuing to speak to God is a demonstration of faith. Reading these words can be relatable to anyone who has experienced similar moments. It is not necessary to be in a context of persecution or calamity to experience this type of spiritual pain. All we need to do is live our daily lives and face life's small and large injustices for Asaph's question to also come to our lips. Why is this happening to me? What this part of the story teaches us is that the pain of waiting, unfair comparisons, and a crisis of faith are not signs of spiritual weakness, but rather part of the journey. There is no formula that eliminates the suffering of those who choose to trust. There are processes, cycles, and moments that, even if they do not make sense now, can be doors to something greater in the future. And as the psalmist continued with his internal conflict, an imperceptible change began to form within him. The same God who seemed distant, silent, and oblivious to suffering was closer than he imagined. Even when the heart fills with questions, the Creator remains attentive, waiting for the right moment to reveal that pain, no matter how real and intense it may be, never goes unnoticed before his eyes. As Asaph's anguish unfolded, something within him began to change, not suddenly, but like a light that gradually overcomes the resistance of darkness. His words continue to carry the weight of doubt, but now they take on a different tone, as if an invisible thread of hope began to intertwine with his pain. There is a moment in Psalm 73 when he decides to enter the sanctuary of God. This detail may seem simple at first glance, but it carries a silent transformation. In making this decision, Asaph takes a step that many only understand after experiencing long periods of spiritual silence. The choice to approach the sanctuary is not only physical, but emotional and spiritual. It is the attitude of someone who, even with a broken heart, places themselves before God with all their doubts, frustrations, and contradictory feelings. This search is not a gesture of someone who has already overcome the crisis, but of someone who recognizes that the only way out may be in that place of worship and reflection. Upon entering the sanctuary, Asaph's perspective begins to change. He begins to see beyond appearances, understanding that the prosperity of the wicked is temporary and that the end of each story can only be truly assessed when viewed through the eyes of eternity. This change in perspective is a milestone in the process of emotional and spiritual healing. It's not that the pain disappears instantly, but the way we deal with it takes on new meaning. This shift in perception connects with another powerful statement found in Psalm 34:18. The text states that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. This statement does not come across as a conditional promise or a reward for the strong, but as a description of who God is in his essence. He does not draw near to those who feign strength, but to those who acknowledge their own weakness. The brokenness that the psalmist describes is not a mere passing sadness. It is a profound state of surrender, a recognition that there is no longer enough human strength to sustain the journey. It is in this state that the presence of God becomes more palpable, not because he was previously absent, but because by recognizing one's own vulnerability, the human being becomes more sensitive to divine action. Asaph's experience of entering the sanctuary and having his sight restored speaks directly to this promise in Psalm 34. The moment he understands the fragility of his own thoughts is also the moment when consolation begins to manifest itself, not with complete answers, but with a peace that begins to fill the spaces previously occupied by revolt. In real life, this process happens in a similar way. The answers do not always come quickly or clearly. Often, the first change is internal, a slight alteration in the way we interpret events. What once seemed like a punishment turns out to be an opportunity for maturity. What was once seen as abandonment begins to be perceived as an invitation to a deeper relationship with God. God's closeness in times of brokenness manifests itself in many ways. It can be through a word read in silence, a simple prayer offered in tears, or even an unexpected hug from someone who barely knows our story. The fact is that God works in the little things, and these subtle signs are the first steps toward a broader restoration. It's important to realize that Asaph's change of perspective did not immediately erase his pain. The suffering was still there, the injustices that had bothered him so much were still there. But something inside him had been realigned. His focus was no longer on external circumstances, but on the certainty that God remains just, even when everything around him seems to be the opposite. This awareness is essential for those who are going through moments of despair. Understanding that brokenness is not a sign of spiritual failure, but rather a fertile environment where God works intensely, completely changes the way we face challenges. It is not about denying the pain, but about understanding that it can be the beginning of a transformation. Psalm 34, with its declaration that the Lord is near to those who are humble, serves as a foundation for this new emotional and spiritual phase. It not only describes a theological reality, but offers an anchor for those who are about to sink in their own emotions. As the psalmist advances on this journey of understanding, his experience becomes a bridge for all those who, at different times, face similar dilemmas. The crisis of faith, the pain of abandonment, the weight of unfair comparison, and the feeling of divine distance are all part of a larger process. And in this process, God's closeness reveals itself as the element that prevents total collapse. There is no magic formula, there are no emotional shortcuts. What exists is a path of internal reconstruction, where each step, no matter how small, represents a conscious choice to continue trusting. Even when the mind screams that all is lost, the spirit, sustained by the presence of God, finds the strength to take another step towards healing. The inner transformation that began to emerge in Asaph's heart opened the way for a deeper understanding of spiritual life. From the moment he recognized God's closeness, even in the midst of his brokenness, something began to reorganize itself within him. The questions continued to exist, but now they were accompanied by a new realization. The pain was not the end. There was a real possibility that this suffering could transform into something greater, something that was not yet visible, but that was beginning to be felt between the lines of the experience. It is in this scenario of emotional reconstruction that Psalm 126 fits as an essential piece in the narrative. When reading the words of this psalm, it is impossible not to notice the transition from a reality marked by pain to a promise of restoration. The psalmist describes the moment when the Lord brought back the captives of Zion, comparing that experience to a dream. The tears that had previously fallen silently to the ground now turned into laughter and songs of joy. This change of scenery did not happen magically or instantly. Those who returned from captivity had scars, painful memories, and marks that time would not easily erase. But their return represented something greater, confirmation that God had not forgotten his people. The same thing happens in the personal journeys of those who face suffering. The marks remain, but their meaning changes. What was once a symbol of defeat becomes a sign of survival and overcoming. The metaphor used by the psalmist is powerful. He speaks of those who sow in tears and who will reap with joy. This agricultural image has enormous spiritual depth. Those who plant in tears often doubt whether there will be a harvest. The soil seems hard, the weather adverse, and each seed sown seems like an act of stubbornness against reality. But it is precisely in this effort, in this insistence on continuing, that the promise is fulfilled. Tears are not wasted. They become the invisible fertilizer that prepares the ground for what is to come. This vision of hope does not ignore past pain. On the contrary, it acknowledges and validates it. The psalmist does not say that the captives returned as if they had never suffered, but that their return was so unexpected and joyful that it seemed like a dream too good to be true. This mixture of positive incredulity and deep gratitude creates an atmosphere of renewal that gives new meaning to the story. The 126th Psalm does not just speak of the past, it also presents a prayer for the future. The request for God to restore again like the streams in the Negev reveals that even after a great victory, there were still areas of life that needed restoration. The Negev, an arid region, depended on seasonal rains to flourish. When the water arrived, the transformation was almost instantaneous. From a dry, lifeless desert, green fields and breathtaking landscapes emerged. This image of sudden transformation after a long period of drought speaks directly to those who feel spiritually barren. Sometimes life feels like an emotional Negev, where tears are the only visible waters. But the psalmist reminds us that the God who transforms deserts into fertile fields is the same God who hears the quietest cries. The seed planted with tears is a metaphor for prayers said through sobs, for steps taken even when feet are tired, for acts of kindness offered when hearts are broken. Harvesting with joy does not mean the process will be easy, but it does guarantee that the outcome will be different from the pain that marked the beginning of the journey. It is interesting to note that the psalmist does not specify the time that passes between sowing and harvest. This reinforces a reality that many face. The wait may be long, and the answer may not come when we would like, but the promise remains. There is an unseen force working behind the scenes of life, aligning circumstances, preparing the ground, and watering each seed with divine care. This concept that tears are not in vain transforms the way we face difficulties. Instead of seeing pain as an enemy, we begin to perceive it as an inevitable element of a larger process. It is not about romanticizing suffering, but about understanding that, even in the worst circumstances, something can be generated within us that will have eternal value. The experience of the people of Israel upon returning from captivity is a testimony that God has the power to reverse situations that to human eyes seem irreversible. They were exiled, humiliated, and helpless. But there was a set time for their return. This hope can be applied to personal situations today. No tear shed goes unnoticed in God's eyes. No prayer made in desperation goes unheeded. There is a process underway, even when the scenario still seems the same. The turning point presented in Psalm 126 is an invitation to perseverance. It is a call to continue planting, even when our hands tremble and our hearts question. Because the harvest will not be just a simple reward, but the confirmation that suffering did not have the last word. As the hopeful words of the 126th Psalm echoed, a deeper truth began to take shape. There are times in life when healing comes not through grand events, but through a single verse, read or remembered at the moment the soul needs it most. It is at this point that the stories of many who suffer meet the Scriptures in an intimate and transformative way. The journey of pain and hope that was being traced was not just a distant tale of ancient characters, but a faithful representation of the inner struggles that each person faces at some point in life. When all seems lost, when human attempts at a solution have run out, the heart becomes vulnerable to a truth that perhaps was not fully understood before. The sacred text, which at times seemed just a collection of ancient words, suddenly takes on a life of its own and becomes a personal response. That is the power of a verse at the right time. It does not matter how many times it has been read before. When the heart is prepared, it arrives with an intensity that breaks through emotional and spiritual defenses. In situations of extreme fragility, it is not uncommon for a specific verse to come to mind, as if inspired by the Spirit of God Himself. Sometimes it is a memory of something heard years ago. In other cases, it is a passage that unexpectedly appears during a random reading of the Bible. What all these experiences have in common is the immediate impact they cause. The heart, previously desolate, finds there a thread of hope that is enough to take the next step. It is impossible to speak of this power without recalling Psalm 34, especially verse 18. When the text states that the Lord is near to the brokenhearted, this is not a theoretical statement, but a reality that materializes in the lives of those who suffer. This verse has been an anchor for many who have passed through dark valleys. It is capable of bringing immediate relief, not because circumstances magically change, but because God's presence becomes tangible even in the midst of chaos. There are stories of people who, on the verge of giving up on everything, opened the Bible at random and found this very verse. Others, in moments of despair, were reminded by friends, family, or even strangers that God is close to those who cry in silence. It is not just the content of the words that makes the difference, but the fact that they arrive exactly when they are most needed. The combination of the Psalms explored so far builds a web of meanings that intertwine in an impressive way. The cry from the depths of Psalm 130, the plea for help in Psalm 120, the existential crisis of Psalm 73, the closeness of God in Psalm 34, and the promise of harvest in Psalm 126 form a narrative arc that reflects the reality of those who go through processes of pain and restoration. Each of these texts, at different times, has the potential to be that verse that heals. In some situations, God's intervention happens in such a subtle way that it is only noticed over time. The immediate impact of a verse may be just the beginning of a transformation that unfolds slowly. But the starting point is that moment when the word touches the heart in an irrefutable way. This experience is deeply personal and, therefore, extremely powerful. The example of Asaph is illustrative in this sense. Even after his crisis of faith, it was when he reflected on the character of God and entered the sanctuary that his perspective began to change. There was no immediate practical solution to the problems that afflicted him, but the understanding that God remains just, even when the reality around him seems to say otherwise, was what brought relief. This internal change is a type of healing that is not always evident, but that, over time, reveals itself to be transformative. There are people who report being freed from destructive thoughts after reading a single verse. Others tell of feeling an inexplicable peace through tears after reading an ancient promise. Each story is unique, but they all point to the same truth. God's word has the power to heal the deepest wounds of the soul. It is important to note that this healing does not automatically eliminate all scars. They remain as a testament to a process experienced, battles faced, and a faith that, although shaken, was not destroyed. The scars become marks of victory, visible reminders that, even in the darkest days, there was divine intervention. What these stories teach us is that God's action can come in unexpected ways. It is not always through a miracle visible to human eyes, nor through a great supernatural manifestation. Often, it is through a line of text, read at the right moment, that heaven invades the heart and brings much-needed healing. Looking back, many can see that this seemingly simple verse was the turning point between giving up and continuing, between paralyzing pain and renewed hope. It was not just a pretty phrase, but the practical manifestation of a God who speaks, listens, and responds. And even when the world seems to be falling apart, this word remains like a beacon, pointing the way out of the storm. The awareness that a single verse can carry such healing power does not mean that the restoration process ends there. On the contrary, often this first impact is just the beginning of a journey of inner reconstruction that requires time, patience, and renewed faith with each new dawn. When someone who was on the brink of emotional or spiritual collapse finds a ray of hope through a biblical text, an opportunity for transformation arises that unfolds in several stages. This transformation does not happen uniformly. There are days when faith seems unshakable and others when doubt returns with full force. The path to healing is an uneven road, full of ups and downs, where the memory of the verse that brought relief becomes an anchor point for the soul amid life's ups and downs. Returning to that text in moments of weakness, rereading it with fresh eyes, rediscovering layers of meaning that were previously unnoticed, all of this is part of the ongoing healing process. It is natural for the human heart to seek logic, rational explanations, and quick solutions, but the process of restoration does not always follow these parameters. The Psalms that have been part of this journey thus far demonstrate this clearly. Each of them expresses a different phase of the relationship with God in the midst of pain. The cry from the depths, the cry for help, the questioning of injustice, the recognition of God's closeness in the brokenness, and the certainty that the harvest will come after the tears, all these moments together form a cycle that faithfully represents the experience of those who go through suffering. What changes at the end of this journey is not only the external circumstances, but mainly the perspective of those who have crossed the valley. Those who previously saw only injustice now see purpose. What seemed like absolute silence from God reveals itself to be a period of preparation where faith was purified and strengthened. Suffering, even if unwanted, becomes an instrument of spiritual growth. Looking back, many can more clearly see the times when God was present, even when he seemed absent. Memories of sleepless nights, prayers that choked up, and tears that seemed to never end are now seen in a new light. These were not wasted moments, but important chapters in a larger story that is being written with care and purpose. God's word remains an inexhaustible source of comfort and guidance. Verses that once went unnoticed now gain new life. Texts that have been read dozens of times begin to reveal details that were previously ignored. This is one of the most extraordinary characteristics of Scripture, its ability to speak differently with each new reading, according to the need of the heart at that particular moment. The experience of finding healing through a verse should not be kept secret. Sharing that testimony may be just what someone else needs to hear to find their own answer. Just as the Psalms were recorded so that future generations could relate to the emotions described there, each person's personal account becomes an extension of this faith tradition. It is not about exposing wounds gratuitously, but about transforming scars into bridges to reach other wounded hearts. It is important to remember that the spiritual journey does not end with overcoming a crisis. New challenges will arise, other phases of pain may present themselves, but the difference is that now there is a living memory that divine intervention is real, that God responds even in unexpected ways. This memory serves as a foundation for the days to come, like an invisible wall that protects faith against the winds of future storms. The invitation is for each person who identifies with this journey to turn their eyes to the Scriptures, not as an ordinary book, but as a fertile field where seeds of hope are ready to germinate. There is a verse waiting to take up residence in each heart, ready to bring the answer at the right time. The search may begin in a psalm, but the effect extends to all areas of life. As I close this reflection, one unshakable certainty remains. Even when all seems lost, there is a living, effective, and deeply personal word capable of transforming tears into testimonies, despair into hope, and weakness into renewed strength. May this truth find an echo in every heart that needs healing. May the memory that God is close to the brokenhearted continue to be a comfort in difficult days, and may the conviction that the harvest of joy will come remain as a promise engraved in the soul. If this message spoke to your heart, leave a comment with the verse that most affected your life in moments of pain. Share this reflection with someone who also needs a word of hope. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to subscribe and follow more content that strengthens faith and renews hope. May God's peace and grace accompany you every step of your journey. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.